Hi, it's Mark from Saphrox Studios and welcome to another Logic tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at part one of our Space Designer series. We're going to find out how Space Designer can work for us as a reverb unit. So in part one, we're going to take a look at Space Designer and we're going to see how it is a reverb unit. Now, it is found in the stock plugin lists within Logic Pro X in the reverb section. So we're going to go and load it up in a second, but I just want to show you what I have created first of all for this particular demo. So I'm going to be using the basic patch for Bosendorfer grand piano. So I have opened up a grand piano patch. Here it is. And the only difference to the stock patch is I have turned off the buses and deleted the buses that it automatically creates as part of its sort of saved preset. So we have, if I move my mixer over onto the pane, you can see here we go. We have the Bosendorfer piano track here. Then we have the stereo out and the master. And you can see that there are buses assigned to the piano track, but they're not actually sending to anything as there is no bus channel running. So let's create a bus channel. I personally prefer to run reverbs on an aux channel. It means that you can have one version of that particular reverb unit running, and then you can send lots of different channel strip bus sends to that one processor, rather than running multiple processors on each individual track you want reverb on. It means your processor is going to be struggling quite heavily. So we're going to run today running it on a bus. So simplest way to do this is to go to your bus, and if you just reselect bus 1, it will automatically open up an auxiliary channel for you just here, which is set up for the input of your bus 1. Okay, so fairly straightforward. And I'm therefore going to set up a plugin on that auxiliary track. So let's go through. You can see it's at the top of the list here, but if it wasn't at the top of the list, you can go down to reverbs and go into Space Designer, and you have a stereo and a dual mono option. We're going to go for the stereo option today. Dual mono we'll get into hopefully in other parts of this tutorial, but today we're just going to look at general stereo reverb. So there we go. We have opened up our Space Designer plugin, and it has opened up with this large and bright default sort of setting. Okay, now currently we're not sending any level down the bus to this. So just to remind you what the piano sounds like, this is it. And if I turn on the bus now, which has a sort of 12 o'clock send, so it's about 50% send, we now are hearing the reverb added on to the piano tone. All right, you might notice because of the way that I've set this up in the aux channel that the plugin's quite sort of intelligent, and it will vary the dry and wet send mixes depending on how you're applying it. So if you are applying it in the channel strip, in fact I shall do that for you right now. If we were to open up a Space Designer in the channel strip, you can see that the dry has been set up to 100% automatically. It realizes that if you're going to use it in the channel strip, that the dry gets full, so you still keep the original clean signal going through, but then you're adding the wet signal of the reverb in. But if you were applying it just purely on a send, you're not going to want the dry going through because you've got the dry going through on your normal channel strip. So let's just turn that other one off. It's always handy to know little things like that. So reverbs, how do we use it as reverb? Well, automatically it is a reverb unit. So you can hear that we have that large space on there. And the simplest way to go about changing these reverbs is to go through the default patches to find something that is suitable for your your taste. Okay, so we can go up to where it says factory default on the top here, and my mouse isn't working. There we go. So go down and we have these lists: large spaces, medium spaces, small spaces. You get the gist. So if you want a small space, we can go into a small room, and we can go into, what have we got, a wooden chamber. I don't really want a chamber, I want just a wide and small snare chamber. Reflection, let's just go small wet room. It's 0.2 seconds long, and it sounds like this. Yep, very, very small. And if we want to go for a large space, It's, I mean, this is simply straightforward stuff. So you can see actually in the listing, by the way, that you get the kind of length of the reverbs that you're expected to hear. So if we go all the way down to the bottom, we've got this longish ones, 14.8. So huge spaces. Okay, so that is the simplest way that we can change the reverbs. And in terms of additional controls that you might want to use, you have these three controls down here: pre-delay, length, and size. Now, those controls, in my opinion, are a little bit different to your usual reverb controls. Generally, you would expect to see like a size and a length to a degree, but the way this particular plugin works is actually controlling something different. And that is because this particular plugin uses IRs to create the way that it produces your reverbs. In a normal standard reverb unit, you would find that you would have an algorithm which is designed to be your small room, or is designed to be your large room, or whatever it may be. But with Space Designer, it is very clever in the fact that it actually loads something called an impulse response. And then it uses the impulse response to affect the algorithm. All right, so it's basically that WAV file, or the audio file that you load in, is creating the algorithm for you. All right, so if you vary that file, then you're going to change the way that Space Designer reacts. Now, the length and the size that we have here isn't affecting your reverb length. What it's actually doing is affecting the audio file that you're using. And in turn, that is going to affect the length and the size of your reverbs. So a little bit different to your usual one, which is why I explain it the way I just done. Okay, so let's take a look at going back to the default patch. So I'm just going to go back into recall default. So it's exactly as you will find it. So you don't have to go through all the listing. So here we have this large and bright. Okay. And if we start to use these three options here, the pre-delay, fairly straightforward to use. We've currently got an 8 millisecond pre-delay as the stock default way that Space Designer opens up. Now, if I change that, and I change that to a big number, 757, we get that delay until the actual verb kicks in. Okay, so it's dry, and then we get the reverb later. Obviously, if you want it to be immediate, we can send that straight back. So this likes to be in the default to be 8 milliseconds, and you can just click the number and you can drag it to exactly something that you want. But there is also a very cool little function here. You'll notice that there is a little quaver set up there. So if you click that, it turns on the sync function to your project's tempo, and you can therefore change this through time divisions of notes, which will match your tempo. So if you change your tempo at any point, your actual reverbs and delays, etc., will match. So if we change this to, because my tempo is at, what have we set? Oh, in fact, I can't see it. I think it's probably at 120. Yes, it is. 120 and 4/4. We're now getting a minims delay. Okay. There we go. All right. So very, very simple little control with your pre-delay. I'm just going to turn that off and bring that back down to 0. Now we have the length. Now the length that we're using here is actually how much of the sample in the audio file and the IR that's being loaded. Now let's take a look up here. We've got this big window, and you can see that we do have like a wave pattern in there. So if we change the length, what we're doing is changing the amount of time that the IR file is being sort of applied to the algorithm. All right, so basically by shortening the length, you're only looking at the beginning of that audio file, and if you increase the length up, you're looking at the entire audio file. So this particular audio file happens to be 1.83 seconds long, so that's giving you a 1.83 second algorithm of reverb. Okay, if you want that to be a smaller room, you therefore could look at the same audio file but just look at the front of it, and it's a shorter amount affected by the volume envelopes that we're seeing at the top here. Okay, so this big curve is your volume envelope, and we are actually controlling the end level and the decay by this final knob here. We have a curve that we can go over the top of the line, and we can drag, where is it? There it is. And we can drag and we can change that curve as well. We have down here your initial attack point, and here we have our initial level. So once again, you can change those and change the curves, which is all about your volume curves and how it reacts. So if you change this final one, we're going to have an even shorter reverb. If we put the length up to full, we can keep the same curve I've just adapted. So there's a big room that ends quicker. It's like it gets damped quicker. All right, so that's the length that's going on. I am going to recall back to as it was. So there we go, back to the original curve. And we have the 1.3 second length section of that particular audio file, which is being used as an IR, okay? But then we have size, which is 100%. Now, in a way, I look at this as if you are able to time stretch out the audio file. So it's like you're taking that length of that audio file, and if you make it less than 100%, then you're speeding it up. And if you are lengthening it and increasing it up to 1,000%, then you are time stretching it to a much longer, 10 times longer, for instance, okay? Now, think about when you time stretch stuff, but in fact, I'm saying time stretch. Let's think about it more in an analog world, okay? So if you have tape to tape and you were slowing the tape down, the pitch drops down and the length goes out, and you start to hear a lot of those characteristics that are in the audio file that are normally playing so quickly that you don't generally notice in your normal audio speed. That all these little artifacts you miss, okay, because they're so quick. And what size does is it stretches everything out in that kind of analog world. So it slows the audio file down that's creating the algorithm. You get a little bit of a drop in pitch, so it makes your rooms sound far, far boomier. But what's awesome is all those little artifacts that you might have in there, they're being spread apart and they react a little bit like reflections. So if you had a huge sort of car park, let's say you've got a concrete car park and you've got huge space and you've got the pillars and stuff like that, and you get weird little echoes that are going off. So here is the factory default setting, but I have increased the size up. Now notice in the way that I've increased the size up that the length of the file has now increased to 13 seconds. So that file has been stretched out. Here's what it sounds like. You've got all those additional characters in the reverb, which are all being stretched apart because all these peaks that were in the original file, they have been separated. So you're starting to hear them and it creates those reflections, and the entire file is creating an algorithm that lasts 13 seconds. So that is just with this simple file. You know, you can go through any of those other default files that you have in there, and you can find some wonderful, wonderful options. Okay, so just opening up this default, we have some weird echoes going on there, and that's because in this particular audio file you can see that we've got these additional peaks that are going on later in the audio file. Now, what we're actually seeing is a stereo field. So when the peak is going down, I believe, yeah, it's going off to the right. Horrible noise I made, but it's going off to the right when it's going down, and it's going off to the left when it's peaking up. So you're getting some really lovely reflections as you're going around, all from these IRs that are being loaded into Space Designer. Okay, so those are some simple controls that you can really start to affect. I mean, this is now over a minute long. So if you're trying to create some wonderful pad synthy tones or samples that you want to create that have extra characteristics in, wonderful way of doing it. If you want to stop them from playing at any point, you just change the knob and it cancels what you were doing a second ago. All right, so once again, I'm just going to go back to recall our default, and we'll start looking at these controls we have here. Now, effectively, what you want to try and do when you're working on your mix is low frequencies really want to be in a mono field. You don't really want to create too much of a stereo low frequency set, because you're just going to get quite a lot of problems in terms of phasing issues, and your stereo width can be created by your higher frequencies. Now what we get in Space Designer is we have this crossover control, which is going to split the frequency into two ranges, your high frequencies and your low frequencies, and depending on where you put that slider depends on where those frequencies will be separated. And then it goes over onto these two controls, your low spread and your high spread, so your low frequency setting and your high frequency spreading, or setting even. So you're going to want your high spread to be fully over, and if you want to try and reduce down the width of your low frequency, then obviously keep it to a lower number. By default it brings it around 38, but if you want to keep it completely and utterly mono, then set it to 0. All right, so it's going to keep a mono low frequency in everything that is underneath here, and everything above is going to be full width spread. All right, and then we're finished off with our dry and wet that we saw earlier. So if you are running in an aux mode, you're going to want your dry probably set to completely off and muted, and then your wet controls you're going to set to how you want. Now sometimes on dry and wet you actually just get a percentage, so it's either 100% wet or off, or 100% dry and off, and then you can blend them. This one actually has cut and boost as well, so if you're finding that some of your reverbs are a little bit boomy and they're creating quite a lot of level, then you can just drop the wet down a little bit so you can keep your levels under control in your channel strips. All right, so these are these three segments that we've got down here. You've also got your input, which runs in parallel series, and you have a slight crossover, and you have your high quality and your offset of your IR. Now, one thing that you might want to do at some point, if we take a look at this particular IR here, we have this peak. Now, let's say you had a sample that you were using that you wanted it to start at that point rather than right at the beginning of the audio file. Let's say you had a little bit of space at the beginning. You can just use this IR offset and you can just bring the file forward. So you've got quite a nice lot of controls that you can use, and of course this reverse, which just spins it round, which is kind of fun. So that's 1.3 seconds, good. Nice reverse reverb for you. Very easy to do, okay? Now we're gonna have a very quick look at the upper section that we've got here. We looked at the volume envelopes earlier. If you find that you ever want to change these and just reset them back to normal, you have this little cog down on the right hand side where you can reset the selected envelope. You can reset all or whatever, all envelopes and the EQ. So that nice little curve that we had down there, we can draw in however we want. But if you want to have any filter EQing as well, we have a filter EQ which works on the same principle, though depending on where you are choosing, you're choosing your frequencies of where your filters are opening. So you can create some wonderful, we'll turn the filter on, wonderful kind of tones just with this. Let's put this in and get it to boom in the middle. There we go. So wow, sort of brightening up and then shutting off. Let's bring that down. Okay, some interesting kind of noises that you can create. And also, if you want to have some final tone shaping, you have an output EQ, which is a very simple EQ, not as big as your usual EQ that you would find in Logic, but it works on the same principles. And you turn that on and off there, and you go through and select your various bands and your cues, etc. You've got it's a fairly straightforward EQ system. All right, so there we go. This is the bottom main section. So I'd say if you're new to Space Designer, go through, use the presets as you're choosing your sizes and your different kind of qualities of your reverb. Then if you want to start playing a little bit more to get a little bit more of your custom patches, start playing with the length and size that you've got down there. And then if you want to get into your volume EQs and your volume envelopes, you've got them all at the top. Now, if you wanted to create something that was very weird, you could go and make your own reverb tone, okay? Now, the way the audio file that you load in as your IR reacts as part of your algorithm is the frequencies that are in the audio are the ones that you will hear. So if you want a very bassy sound, just use low frequencies. If you pan it to the right, then that's going to create your panning feel if you change your panning around, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just once again reset this back to default, and I am going to create our own IR, okay? And I'm going to do that with a drum beat. I'm going to make a percussive drum beat. We're going to have some very short sort of stabs, etc., that are going to be going through, and we'll see if we can create a rhythmic feel to the reverb just by creating our own IR. All right, so let's just shut that down for a second, and I'm going to open up a drum channel. Okay, so let's just go into create a software instrument, and I'm going to use my own patch in my user patches of my SoCal with additional symbols that I have used in other tutorials. So if you want to find out about those tutorials, just have a look wherever the card popped up at the top. All right, so here we have a producer style kit with some extra bits and pieces going on. It sounds a little bit like this. Okay, so that is going to be what we're going to use today. I'm going to use a little click, so let's just get my ear in for a metronome. All right, so I'm going to do 4 bars of a beat at 120. So here we go, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so there we go. We've got, click off. We have 4 beats, or 4 bars of a beat using the SoCal kit. Now let's turn that into our reverb, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick a version of that. Let's burn that down there. I'm just going to go into Bounce, Project Selection, Command B, PCM, that'll find, add to project, whatever, those are all good. And we shall stick that onto my desktop, and we'll call that Blah Drums. Right, there it is. Okay, we can get rid of that. Right, back to Sound Designer. All right, so opening up our Sound Designer that is running on our aux send in exactly the same way we were before with our initial piano tone. But now let's load that percussive drum beat as our IR that will affect the algorithm of our reverb. All right, so what we do is we click on this point where it says 1.8 large and whatever it said, and we can load IR, and we can load IR and initialize. So if you initialize, basically it just resets all your EQs. Otherwise, if you're loading the IR, it's going to keep the volume curves that you had on whatever you were loading before. All right, and I'm just going to load IRs because I think that this volume curve that we've got here just works absolutely fine. It's all good. Obviously, you can change it later. So load IR. I'm going to go to our desktop, and I'm going to go to Blah Drums. Okay, so there we go. We got our Blah Drums. You can see it's 8.38 long. That's 100%, and we can't play it as such like that. But if I now play a piano tone, we should start to hear the rhythmic effects of that audio file. So that's very simple to do, really. You're just creating a percussive pattern which you can load in. I could have done loads of things with sort of synth noises on the right and left or whatever it may be to create the EQ features that I want to brighten up. You can just do some wonderful, weird and crazy things, or very useful things, you know. So there we go. If we want to change that, and we want to change those drums and speed them up, sped everything up, it's gone up in pitch. If you want to have that kind of really dark sound, don't quite what's going to happen here. Certainly a bit weird, okay? Maybe a little bit too long. Let's just double length it to 200. It's almost like an arpeggiator, but very, very cool. There we go. So in terms of making reverbs, it's a very, very cool tool. Now, there is another reverb unit. We've got Chromeverb in Logic, which is excellent and is one of my favorites, but it doesn't load IRs, so you can't get it to do crazy things like that. And Space Designer is your only IR loader. So of course, loading IRs as well, it means that you can go on the old interweb and you can search for all kinds of IRs that are specific reverbs that you want to load in, and then off you go. It's very, very simple kind of stuff to do. Very small controls that can be very, very powerful, all based on the audio file that you load as your impulse response. There we go. I've been Mark, Saphrox Studios. We're going to have a couple more parts to this this tutorial. They'll be showing up somewhere, etc. We're going to look at part 2. We're going to look at how we can use Space Designer as an EQ, and we're going to use the IRs to enable us to do that. And in part 3, we shall look at it as a speaker emulator. So please go and watch those. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I want to hear about your thoughts in the comments section below. It'd be great to hear from you, and of course subscribe. Like I say, I'm Mark, Saphrox Studios. See you later.